Sharper Than a Serpent's Tooth. Written by the Hanged Man 317 and read by Purple Star. Chapter 8. Shinsou.
Acceptance letters are in. You coming?
Era.
Need me to hold your hand while you open it?
Shinsou.
Fuck you. Thought it'd be fun to open them together. Besides, if I don't force you to look at it, you'll probably just forget about it. Go lift weights instead, you fucking jock.
Era.
It seems I've hit a nerve. I'll be over in 10. Also, for the record, calling me a jock who lifts weights is not an insult.
Shinsou.
How about a jock who can't remember the quadratic equation?
Era.
Make that 15 minutes. I want to give you a proper head start.
Shinsou.
Now who's hit a nerve?
Era slipped her phone back into her pocket, tugging at the strap of her backpack as she neared the post office. It was heavy, even with just the essentials. Water, food, weapons, change of clothes. Things she'd need for a quick getaway. She'd taken to carrying an emergency kit at all times, just in case. She didn't want to do this. Even entering the post office felt wrong, suffocating, like walking across the bottom of a pond through murky water and weeds that grasped her wrists and ankles. Her temple throbbed, a holdover from a few nights ago, and the confrontation with Eraserhead. Her head had been aching ever since. The lack of sleep probably didn't help matters, but Era was too twitchy to risk it. The letter was easy to find. It was the only thing in her mailbox, other than a few ambitious magazines that were promptly tossed in the garbage. The plain white paper burned in her hands, begging to be thrown out as well, but instead Era tucked it in her pocket and jogged over toward Shinsou's house. Better to get this over with. As usual, no one seemed to be home. Era knocked out of custom, but quickly abandoned that to open the door and slip inside, toeing off her shoes before making her way down the hall toward Shinsou's room. She'd never met his parents. From what he told her, they weren't often in the picture, working or minding their own business in other parts of the house. Avoiding him came the unspoken truth. Took you long enough. Shinsou didn't even look up as she opened the door, leaning against the headboard of his bed. Sorry, this asshole kept texting me.
Hilarious. You got it?
Era brandished the letter, forcing herself not to regard it with too much disgust. Ducking to the side, Shinsou procured his own, identical slip of paper as Era settled on the ground with her back pressed against a wall. Well? Shinsou stared at the letter in his hands, face expressionless, though Era could see a twitch in his fingers and a tension to his shoulders. You ready? Turning the letter over in her hands, Era gave a slow nod. She heard him breathe deeply, settling himself before he ripped open the envelope. Not seeing an easy way to delay this, Era did the same. Her eyes flickered across the letter, both of them consumed by breathless silence, as bits and pieces began to coalesce into sentences, into paragraphs of explanations that,
Score on the written portion was merely adequate. You received outstanding marks on the practical exam.
Era's fingers tightened around the paper, crumpling it slightly in her grasp.
Though your behavior was reckless, you showed a desire to help others, even at risk to yourself.
Across the room, she swore she could hear Shinsou's back straighten.
Have chosen to award you 25 rescue points, which in conjunction with your written score places you in the UA General course, a fine track that has produced many capable.
Her eyes were darting across the page now, information barely registering as she struggled to keep her breath from quickening in.
Should you choose to enroll, you will be accepted into Class 1C. Welcome to UA. Your education awaits.
Fucking damn it. Era repressed a wince as Shinsou slammed his fist into the wall with a sharp crack, drawing it away to leave a faint imprint in the drywall. The letter was crumpled in his hands, and his face, usually expressionless, was twisted up in the beginnings of fury.
"General studies,"
he spat.
"Of course."
We got in. The idea had barely managed to take root in her mind. The very concept of UA had already been so thoroughly banished, discarded in favor of other, more desperate plans.
"That test was bullshit."
Era's eye snapped toward Shinsou, his anger having simmered to a quiet, shuddering hum that left him staring down at the half-crumpled paper in his hands, as if he might burn a hole through it by force of will alone. Oh, right. He wanted to be a hero. And so do I. Era mercilessly crushed that fleeting thought beneath the heel of her boot. She hadn't made the cut. She'd been so close to failing UA in its entirety. She wasn't good enough to be a hero. A danger to herself and others. Shinsou, though. He could be brusque, put on an air of tired apathy, but Era knew that he was kind. He cared so much. So much that it threatened to burn her with its passion. When Era looked at him, she saw a raging fire that would stop at nothing to achieve his goals. It was burning him even now, she knew. The failure scorching at his bones and leaving blistering scars along the inside of his flesh. She was a flickering candle in comparison, a burnt-out husk of a human being who'd long outlived her usefulness. Era looked at him and found herself lacking every time. Shinsou deserved to be a hero. Let's go. Era was already up and halfway out the door when Shinsou managed to get over his initial shock, fighting through the anger that must have been tearing him apart.
"What?"
"To the gym," she said shortly. "Come on."
"Why?"
he managed to splutter out, even as he slipped off the bed. "We're gonna spar. It'll make you feel better." He gave a hollow laugh, stuffing the letter violently into his pockets.
"I doubt it."
"Trust me." She flashed him a weak smile, the kind that didn't quite have the effort in it to reach her eyes. Era left the house, and he followed. They didn't speak the whole walk to the gym, letting the anger and shame and righteous fury sweep over them in waves. Era didn't know how to break the silence, didn't know how to make that hurt go away with something so simple as words. All she knew was pain and bloodied knuckles and the satisfying crunch of broken bones. She hoped it would help, because this was all she had to offer. This was all she was good for. The gym was empty, and the sparring mats were already laid across the floor. Good. Throwing the bag against the wall and slipping off her shoes, Era stepped onto a mat and turned to look at Shinsou expectantly. He hesitated only briefly before stepping up to join her, a different fire burning in his eyes now. Era recognized that one. He was itching for a fight, same as her. Sometimes the only way to work through frustration like this was fists.
"That's bullshit,"
said Shinsou, breaking the silence first as he sank into a fighting stance.
"It's skewed towards physical quirks."
As she brought her fists up, it occurred to Era that she didn't even know what his quirk was. She'd never thought to ask, aside from wondering if it was something they needed to train alongside his combat. He'd just given her a wry grin and said it was more of a mental thing, not something he could fight with, and she hadn't pressed him on it. "What are you gonna do about it, then?" asked Era evenly. "Stand around and bitch?" That won her a strangled snarl and a quick jab to her stomach, which she easily brushed aside and countered with a knee to the outside of his thigh. Wincing, Shinsou aimed another hook at her face, following it up with a low punch as Era ducked. She took it to the gut, smiling through a harsh gasp, and pushing forward to smash her fist against his ribs, his stomach, the guard of his arms and shoulders. She pressed him back, grabbing at his wrists with one hand and pulling him forward, only to jab her leg into the underside of his knee and force him down. With her other hand, she slammed his head into the mat. When she heard a gasp of pain, Era released him and leapt away, leaving him to scramble to his feet alone.
"This is all you're good for, little bird."
She shook her head briskly, cracking her neck and shifting her weight from side to side. Okay, so maybe Shinsou wasn't the only one who had some issues to work through. Era wished she'd been able to fight that stupid fucking pro. The one too busy playing therapist to do his fucking job. That would have been a proper match. Something to leave her too distracted with aches and bruises to worry about this sort of thing. Shinsou had improved, but he would never have her training. She prayed he never would. "You said it yourself. It's possible to get into the hero course from Gen Ed," said Era, noting how he stood warily, and wiped a faint dribble of blood from his nose. "This isn't a dead end." "That's not the point," he hissed, surging forward with a flurry of blows that Era managed to bat aside and meet with her own. She reveled in the feeling of her knuckles connecting with flesh, leaving herself open to wildly seek out solid hits against her opponent. The bout quickly devolved into a grappling match, Era twisting his arm behind his back and flipping him onto the mat once more with a dull thud. Stepping away and grinning as new eggs bloomed along her sides, where he'd scored some hits. "What's your point then? That you're mad? That it isn't fair?" The iron tang of blood welled up in her mouth, and she spat it out to the side. "You know what?" wheezed Shinsou as he struggled to his feet once more. "Maybe that is my point. I'm pissed off. Is that so wrong?" "No." Era bared her teeth into a smile. "But for someone so angry, you're doing a pretty shit job at taking me down." With a growl, Shinsou rushed at her again, and this time Era didn't waste time with the pretenses of a boxing match. She caught him mid-lunge, fist tangling in the collar of his shirt as she brought an elbow into his gut. Pain sparked across her cheeks as he managed to scrape his knuckle along her face, but Era only tightened her grip on his shirt and tossed him over her shoulder once more, throwing him down onto his back. "The test was unfair? Life isn't fair. So fucking do something about it. Fight dirty. Fight to win. Give it everything you've got. Because fuck knows the world's not gonna pull any punches." Shinsou groaned, eyes blazing as he rolled over onto his stomach. "You know what?" "What?"
"Fall over."
White-hot nothing. Drowning. Gasping for air because...
"Walls closing in."
Because she couldn't.
"Walls closing in. Can't breathe. Can't breathe."
Nails scrabbling for something. Anything. But there was nothing to hold on to find purchase against. It was just nothing filling her lungs, suffocating her with cruel intention, drowning, drowning, drowning.
"You can't escape what you are, little bird."
Era opened her eyes. She was laying flat on her back, the boy standing over her with a tired and bloody grin. "Looks like I win this." Her weight crashed into his without a hint of finesse, knocking him to the ground with the full force of her body and pressing a knife tight against his throat. The boy opened his mouth to speak again, snapping it shut when Era's chest rumbled with a low growl, when she pressed her blade closer to the skin to reveal a thin trickle of blood. There was a buzzing in her head, a low hum that overwhelmed her with,
"Walls closing in, walls closing in."
That clutched at her throat with long, slender claws, that tore and trembled with the,
"Won't wash out. Red, red, red. It won't wash out. It can't. I can't.
Breathe."
"I can't."
She couldn't breathe, knives shivering in her aching hands, knuckles bloodied by blows she couldn't remember landing. And who was this boy? Was he the mark, the play, the job? Was this what she needed to do To make the suffering finally end?
Failure is not an option, little bird.
But he was afraid, looking up at her with wide eyes and a clenched jaw, fingers tightening into the mat beneath them. And why were they on a mat? Because they'd been sparring. Because they'd just gotten their letters and Shinsou had been hurting and she just wanted to make it
Stop. Make it stop. It won't stop hurting, please.
But this was all she could do. All she could...
This is all I'm good for.
And she couldn't...
I can't.
Breathe. Era did. A sickly, shuddering thing. She drew her knife away and stood, ignoring the trembling of her limbs as she stepped back. Shinsou didn't move. Era didn't blame him. Please don't do that again. That wasn't her speaking, was it? Oh fuck. Oh fuck. That wasn't her speaking. Her voice couldn't sound so calm, so cold. Not when her mind was a screaming, howling mess of guilt and rage and pain. So who was it? Who was talking, tearing her soul from her body to hang her limbs with razor wire, to lead her through bloody motions like a lifeless marionette? Shinsou gave a strangled laugh, hand clenching into a fist against the mat. Seriously? Something was wrong. That was a distant but urgent feeling, one that broke through the buzzing at her ears, but Era could almost laugh herself because, oh, really? Perhaps a more useful thought would be to point out something that wasn't wrong. There was nothing to say. Era had never been good with words, not like this anyway. She could manipulate, string along, twist people's thoughts against them, but this was something more gentle and delicate that she could never hope to master. All Era knew was how to make him hate her, and it seemed like she'd already accomplished that. I'm sorry, she said in a voice that barely felt like her own. An improvement? Shinsou was on his feet, and Era blinked at how fast the movement was. Or perhaps it was more that she was slow, too slow.
Failure is not an option, little.
Seriously? He snapped, the dark circles beneath his eyes only serving to accentuate his blistering fury. Era flinched at his voice, as if scalded. You're sorry? You're just like everyone else, aren't you? A fucking hypocrite. A liar. After everything, you still... Stop. She couldn't do this right now. Not with the darkness, and the buzzing, and the knife in her hands, and... Oh God, there was blood on the knife in her hands.
Won't wash out. Won't wash out.
And she wanted to do it. She was going to do it. No hesitation as she pressed the blade to his throat and waited for the order. It had been easy. Please. Era hated how pathetic she sounded. She hated the knife in her hands. Hated how she could see Shinsou eyeing it warily, keeping his distance.
Afraid of me. He's afraid of me.
She tucked the knife back beneath the folds of her clothes. But his eyes didn't turn away. They only narrowed further. You didn't even want to be a fucking hero. His voice had turned low, with a promise of danger that Era knew he couldn't keep. She had met people who talked like that and meant it. People whose expressions betrayed just how eager they were for the barest opportunity to rip you apart, slowly and deliberately, grinning all the while. Why are you here? Why did you even help me? Would you have done the same if you knew my quirk? She didn't know the answer to that. Era tried to step back, to...
Run away. Run away.
Because that was the only constant in her life, the running. But her treacherous muscles wouldn't obey. They still shook, seized by the realization that she had almost killed him, and it would have been easy. In the end, it didn't matter. Apparently he took her silence as answer enough. Shinsou's face twisted into a sneer. Are you seriously afraid of me right now? Too scared to answer? You were just telling me to give it my all. That the world wouldn't pull any punches. Life isn't fair, so I should do something about it. I guess you only meant that for people like you, right? Well, not everyone can have a quirk like yours, Era. A quirk like... Oh, right. She told him her quirk was physical enhancement, just like it said on her papers. Era could have laughed, could have let hysteria bubble up in her throat, wrap its arms around her and squeeze until she was nothing but a giggling mess on the floor. It was true. Not everyone could have a quirk like hers. A quirk that twisted and writhed beneath her flesh, that set her nerves on fire every time she so much as stubbed a toe. Was Era afraid of Shinsou? Her mind was too scattered to even consider the question properly. Too mixed up in the then and now, in puppet strings and rusted pliers. Her fingers twitched, the beds of her nails aching, and for a moment, Era was sitting in a chair, with crooked hands and bloody fingers that scraped and scrabbled for any purchase they could. Soft flesh where her nails used to be. Just for a moment, and then it was gone, and she was standing with sweat cooling uncomfortably along her back, and Shinsou standing in front of her, yelling, face melting from anger to his usual blunt indifference. And that did hurt, because Era hadn't seen that look directed at her since she'd first talked to him. Months of trust, all gone with a stupid fucking moment of blind panic. Shinsou took a breath, and Era's quick eyes caught how he tried to hide how it shuddered deep in his chest by sticking his hands into his pockets. Whatever. I've dealt with people like you before. Shinsou, just stay out of my way. He shouldered past her almost lazily. Almost. There was a flinch where he touched her, as if she might burn him, and then she was alone. Always alone. It was better this way. Era found herself in her apartment sometime later, unsure where the new bruises at her knuckles had come from, but positive that she deserved them. She set her bag down carefully, about to fall into her bed before she thought better of it and sat down with her back propped up against a wall instead. The bed would be too soft, too suffocating, like she was trapped and drowning and...
Wall's closing in, I can't...
You're a fucking mess, you know that? No one answered. Alone. The glare of the computer screen strained his eyes through the darkness. But Shouta was too busy to get up and turn on the light. There was a class to prepare for, criminal organizations to research, and a vigilante to catch. He clicked through the various camera angles for the practical exam, paying close attention to the kids he knew would soon be his students. Already he could tell who would be problem children. Could feel it in the pressure behind his eyes and the clench of his jaw when he saw a child surge forward on searing explosions, heedless of the applicants behind him as he blasted smoldering shrapnel into the air with a manic grin. When he watched one future student break his bones to take down a 0-pointer. The kid had spunk. He'd give him that. Shouta leaned back in his chair and pinched the bridge of his nose, sighing heavily. He could already tell this class was going to be such a headache. Hopefully he wouldn't have to expel anyone on the first day again. But if that kid couldn't use his quirk without destroying himself, then he might have no choice. Leaning forward again, Shouta opened a new tab, the one with the student files. He'd already checked and triple-checked. No one in his class had a Regeneration quirk, and the only one that came close in 1B was a recommendation student. That didn't really fit the profile he was starting to build in his head, and that, combined with the fact that he'd seen her quirk in action, and it didn't look similar at all, could rule out all of the hero course kids. The business course was also out, and didn't fit in with her MO besides. A vigilante would want to become a hero. There would be no other reason for her to apply to UA.
If she applied at all.
A dry voice unhelpfully supplied at the back of his mind.
Tsukaguchi could be grasping at straws.
He batted the thoughts aside impatiently. Straws were all they had right now. The kid was a ghost, and every interaction he'd had with her just made him more concerned for her safety. Something was wrong. Every bone in his body screamed it whenever he so much as looked at her. It was the same kind of feeling he had when he looked at his future students, the ones he knew would cause problems, would need guidance, but multiplied by tenfold. So he'd keep searching. No kids with regeneration in support, and he hadn't seen her use any gadgets during her little ventures. General education could be. Regeneration wasn't exactly suited to the entrance exam, just like a myriad of other quirks that could be a boon in hero work. Shouta cut off his grumble, feeling himself slipping into another rabbit hole, and shunted those thoughts aside. He could raise his objections at the staff meeting, like he did every year. He scrolled through the files, a frown tugging at his lips. The only kid who had any sort of regeneration was a boy in 1D who had an endless supply of teeth? Shark traits. Creepy, but not exactly enough to stop a bullet. Oh, and here was another kid, also a boy, who had near unbreakable bones. Useful, but again, not what he was looking for. So she was lying then.
Or she's just not here.
Again, Shouta shook that away, face twisting into another scowl, as he leaned closer to the monitor. Yes, there was always the chance that she hadn't applied. There also was the chance that she'd applied and failed, but he'd do his due diligence. If she wasn't here, then he'd start looking for standout applicants. But he wasn't going to get his hopes up on that. It was a lot to wade through, and besides, she wasn't unskilled. Shouta had a feeling that she'd be able to make it in, even with the disadvantages of her quirk. He'd check the footage, see if the quirks registered matched with the ones on screen. Then he'd start widening the net. Groaning, Shouta glanced at his bed and considered just turning in now. This was going to be a lot of work, and no matter how he felt about the vigilante, his students took priority. Classes were going to start soon, and he had to be giving that his full attention. If he ran an assessment test that might suss out whether the Midoriya kid could actually use his quirk, and it'd be useful for the others as well, a good benchmark. Finally he grinned, glad that something was going right with his work. It really would be a shame to drop Midoriya. Shouta flipped back to the footage, watching the thunderous shockwaves of his quirk, noting the crumpled metal where his fist impacted, the way his limbs hung limp and twisted as he plummeted to the ground. Shouta sighed. It didn't matter how self-sacrificing you were, a quirk like that would always be a liability. Wait. What did he know about his vigilante? That her home life was probably troubled? That she didn't seem to think much of heroes or their ability to help her? And that she was a self-sacrificing idiot. She jumped in front of a bullet for him, and still that left him with gritted teeth, because even if she could heal through it, she shouldn't have had to. He'd let himself get distracted, made a rookie mistake that almost cost him his life, and she'd clearly been in a lot of pain. Slumped and woozy against the wall, barely able to form words past the blood in her mouth. While the physical damage wasn't permanent, it couldn't be a pleasant experience. But she hadn't hesitated. Shouta began to look through the scores of all the applicants, noting their rescue points. Obviously, the Midoriya kid had the most, with his impressive display of power in saving his classmate, but there was a general studies student not far behind. He pulled up the video feed, watched as an idiot girl dragged her fallow test taker not away from, but towards the 0-pointer. Watched her make the decision to stop, and toss him the few feet he needed to be clear of danger. watched her stare up at the looming hunk of metal and just stop. It hadn't stood up before, hadn't been his business. She'd clearly just frozen in panic, and it wasn't even one of his students besides. But watching now, he could see that it wasn't any sort of panic. Every action was deliberate, with an acceptance that almost gave him chills. She just stood there, staring up at looming death, and waited for it to slam down upon her. Could be nothing. Could be everything. Shouta pulled up her file. Suzuki era. 168 centimeters. Short black hair, blue eyes, medium build. Could be her, but a lot of people fit that description. And other than height and hair color, there hadn't been a lot to go on under her costume. Standard physical enhancement quirk. Nothing special, but something like that could be easily faked. He flipped through her footage and didn't find anything that could contradict it. She did seem to sustain some injuries in a couple of her takedowns, but with the video quality he couldn't be sure. And she was impressive. Shota's nose wrinkled as he pulled up her file again. Why wasn't she in the hero course? With the added rescue points, she'd gotten a high enough score on the practical to lend her a spot. The answer quickly became obvious. Her test scores scraped the bottom of average. They'd clearly decided to let her in on the off chance her grades would improve and she could prove herself enough to be let into the hero track. As it was, she was in Class 1C. Shouta closed his eyes briefly, feeling that headache intensify. Hizashi's class. Of course. On the bright side, he'd be able to monitor the situation closely, even if Hizashi was sure to be absolutely insufferable about it. If this kid was Sparrow, then he'd find out sooner or later. And if she wasn't, well, he'd just have to keep digging. Shouta sighed, settling back into his chair and resting his eyes. Well, he certainly did know how to keep busy, didn't he? End of Chapter 8.